Well, let's return to our discussion of John Calvin. I want to mention again something that Leslie Ann discussed last time, which is that Calvin is writing at a time when, first of all, philosophical education and philosophical discussion has declined significantly. A lot of the distinctions that would have been drawn 200 years earlier are not really drawn very clearly in Luther or Calvin. And I don't mean to pick on them personally, they're not really drawn in the philosophical culture of the time. Think about who the great philosophers are between William of Ockham and Descartes. Can you name any? Yeah, you sort of draw a blank, right? And you continue to draw a blank even if you actually know quite a bit about philosophy. And it's not just because you're undergraduate students that you draw a blank. I sort of draw a blank, and eventually I can come up with some names. But the fact is, it was a time when philosophical conversation was very much submerged. Now, this book is written, published around the same time that the scientific revolution is beginning to occur. And so that's a second thing. If philosophical education, philosophical discourse of decline, the sciences are becoming a focus of much greater attention. And the idea of natural law is something that is exerting a much more powerful influence over the mind of people, not only in the sciences, but in philosophy and in theology. And so we've got a sort of decline of philosophy that's been going on, but an increase in scientific thinking, and those things affect Calvin. In some ways, what I'm saying is a sort of apology in advance, because there are certain places where you really try to pin Calvin down and say, well, wait, what exactly is the view? How is he reconciling these two ideas? I think it's just indeterminate how he's doing it. There are certain distinctions that would have been drawn earlier that are just not being drawn here. And so it's a little bit hard to say how things combine. Now, in a way, that can be liberating, because you can think, aha, there are various ways in which I can combine these puzzle pieces. I've got a puzzle full of pieces. Well, think of it this way, a puzzle with vague boundaries on a lot of the pieces. That gives you some flexibility about putting it together. It also means it's a little bit less clear what the overall picture is, right? Now, if you think about the puzzle analogy, physically it's hard to have vague boundaries, but I suppose we could get that if you took a jigsaw puzzle and like sandpapered the edges of the pieces and sort of made them fuzzier. It's a little bit less clear how everything fits together, and I think that's true. In any case, I want to begin with the opening of the Institutes. This is a work of theology, but also of philosophy, and in some ways it's really an existential work. His main interest is highly practical. It's not really figuring out theoretical niceties. It's a question of figuring out things that make a difference to people's ordinary lives. And so that's really his main focus. Now that's brought out more clearly by this highly abridged version, because it doesn't include the long, complicated digressions that sort of take you far away from that into more theoretical subjects. But I think it does indicate how he's really trying to talk to the typical Christian believer and not trying to talk sort of at a high plane of philosophy. So in that respect, he's doing something very different from those thinkers of the 14th century who are really trying to speak to a relatively limited group. Calvin's really trying to reach everyone. So he begins this way. Our wisdom, if it is to be thought genuine, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. As these are, now first of all, let's stop there. Our wisdom, if it's to be thought genuine, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and ourselves. Now, is that right, first of all? Is that what wisdom consists in? Knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves? We know a lot of stuff, right? I mean, not just about God and about ourselves or something, and maybe we don't know anything about either one, but putting that aside, what are the things you think you know? Okay, mathematics, maybe? What?
Yeah, I just said 2 plus 2 is
2 plus 2 is 4, good, so we might know basic things about mathematics. What else are things you think you know?
Beer is delicious.
Beer is delicious, okay, good. That's something that's knowledge of the world, but also something that is in some way normative, right? Beer is good, beer is delicious. Delicious is actually what philosophers refer to as a thick term. It's descriptive, but it's also a term of praise, right? And so it's both normative and descriptive at the same time. And lots of things are like that. If I refer to somebody as courageous, I'm partly describing them, partly also praising them, describing them that way. What are other kinds of knowledge? good historical knowledge. And so we know, for example, that the Peace of Westphalia took place in 1648, or that World War II ended in 1945. What other kinds of linguistic knowledge, good. You know something about language and how it works. You might know that God is a noun, for example, but it closely is an adverb. Or that, actually, how do you say miss in German? Frau is Mrs. Yeah.
Fraulein.
Jungfrau?
Okay, part of it, yeah. Is it Fraulein, Fraulein, or Fräulein? Isn't it Fräulein?
Fräulein sounds better.
Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry to ask, but I spent much of my weekend, and actually the last couple of weeks, in rehearsals and then performances for The Sound of Music. And they kept saying Fraulein. And I kept thinking, no, it should be Fräulein. Fräulein Maria, not Fraulein. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to be Fräulein Maria. That sounds like a sort of Cajun pronunciation of the German. Anyway, it was strange, but I think they actually picked it up from the movie, where they say it that way. Oh, boy, anyhow, let's go back to this. So we have lots of different kinds of knowledge. Nevertheless, those kinds of knowledge are, notice he doesn't say our wisdom, if it is to be thought genuine, consists almost entirely in our knowledge of mathematics and history and beer. No, it's knowledge of God and ourselves. Now, what ties them especially to wisdom? Why are they more relevant? Yeah.
They're easier to experience, I guess.
In some ways, he does think they are easier to experience and more universal, right? Everybody experiences them. That beer is delicious, that can be only experienced and known by people who are lucky enough to taste beer, right? But the knowledge of ourselves, we're always with ourselves, right? So everybody in a certain sense has the capacity for that.
So it just has an effect on how you approach things, what you think you can do or what you think you cannot do.
Ah, good. It has, exactly. It affects what I think I can do, what I think I can't do. So in a sense, it's universally applicable. What I think of myself and my position in the world is something that is going to affect me all the time, whereas knowledge of beer may be something that affects me. Well, it affects me all the time, then I've got a problem. And so you might say, yeah, that's something that affects me only in limited context. Similarly, 2 + 2 is 4, highly useful and helpful to getting the right answer and forming the right judgment in all sorts of situations. Nevertheless, lots of situations are not like that. I remember when my daughters were studying calculus. Both of them actually said, how is this going to be useful to me? I don't understand what value this really has. And I remember saying, I use my knowledge of calculus every day. I said, oh, come on, no, you don't. I said, yes, I do. How? I'm not telling you. Actually, I'm a philosopher of mathematics in a way, in a vague way I sort of do. But in another respect, you might say, yeah, that's something highly applicable only in certain kinds of situations. Now, my knowledge of myself applies all the time. Now, he does say, and here's the really important thesis, these are closely connected. It's not easy to decide which comes first and which comes second. He says no one can assess himself without turning his thoughts toward God. The God is who he lives and moves. Because it's quite obvious the gifts we possess cannot possibly spring from ourselves. Our very being is sustained by God alone. The blessings that spill out from heaven are like streams leading us to the fountain. Here again, the endless good which exists in God becomes more obvious besides our poverty. Most of all, the sad ruin in which man's first rebellion plunged us compels us to turn our eyes upwards. Now, there are several important ideas here, and one of them I want to isolate for a moment. Lost myself best. Yes, well, see, there's an item of knowledge. Excellent. But actually, according to Calvin, not quite true. Yes, so, knowledge of ourselves. He thinks really we can't know ourselves without knowing God. Why not? Well, partly he thinks that the knowledge of the self really does propel us to knowledge of God. Now, in what ways specifically? What is he citing that leads us to a knowledge of God? Now, there's a positive side to this and a negative side. So we can say, oh, on the positives, what do we get? First of all, he says, yes, to To begin with, no one can assess himself without turning his thoughts toward the God in whom he lives and moves, because it is quite obvious, notice the reference there to Paul on Mars Hill, because it is quite obvious that the gifts we possess cannot possibly spring from ourselves. What does he have in mind? The gifts we possess cannot possibly spring from ourselves.
Intellect and will.
Good, ultimately intellect and will. So yes, there are these goods that we possess, and really I think he has in mind, yes, intellect and will. These are things that indicate that God must be the source. Now, insofar as we think about intellect, what is the governing goal, the end, the telos of the intellect? The intellect aims at what? Well, in some ultimate sense, yes, but closer to home, truth, right? And the will aims at what? Good, yes. And so, really, it's truth and goodness that sort of propel us to the idea of God. The intellect, our own capacities to know the truth, our own capacities to achieve the good, to the extent that we have them, are things that point us toward God. And so that's part of this. He also says, look, that our very being is sustained by God alone. So it's partly these goods, it's partly existence itself. That propels us to the idea of God as the being that is the ultimate cause of and support of our existence. Now he says, the blessings which constantly spill out. So, and the endless good in God. So there are blessings. In other words, things besides intellect and will, but just good things. Like what good things? Propel us to the thought. What kinds of blessings? Keep in mind, he's writing in the 16th century. That's actually kind of an awful time in human history.
Having intellect.
Well, having an intellect, yes, and all that. So yes, it's partly this.
Maybe nature.
Yeah, nature, all of the gifts of nature. Yes, exactly. All the things that support human existence in nature, all the things that bring us joy, and so on. So these are things that he thinks point us to God. He says, but all, most of all. And now we get to the negative side. And the negative side is we get the sense of our own inadequacy. He says, the sad ruin to which man's first rebellion plunged us compels us to turn our eyes upwards. Not only in desperate need we may ask for what we want, but also because in fear we may learn humility. Since the fall, we have exhibited every kind of sin. And so, really, it is our own. Now, what? Well, yeah, weakness, tendency to sin. They also propel us to the idea of God. So he thinks, and part of what interests me about this is that he is really thinking, and we'll see further elaborations of this as we go on, but he's thinking of some of the traditional arguments for the existence of God. And he isn't getting into the details of the arguments, but he's saying, in a certain sense, there is a point to these. There's a kind of traditional argument from truth, that, wait a minute, if there were not a God, then what kind of standard for truth would there be? Well, he's saying, in a way, yes, truth points us toward the existence of God. The same thing as goodness. We have this idea that without God, there wouldn't be any sort of thing of value. And so you find arguments for moral value in Kant, as well as earlier philosophers. We've got this idea of existence. What is responsible for my own existence? How is it possible that I'm here? In a sense, it's an appeal to causation and an appeal to the core thought of the cosmological argument. The blessings. It's talking about the wonders of nature, the wonders of the universe, and in effect the design argument is hidden here. All of those are ways of saying, look, in a sense, it's not a question. I think he thinks our own intellects are inadequate to really fully understand things. Nevertheless, he thinks there's some core of truth in all of those arguments. Yeah, think about the notion of truth. Think about the good. Think about existence and the cause of your existence. Think about the wonderful designs that give us blessing in nature. All of those point us toward God. Now, he says the knowledge of God also points toward us in a way. He says, yes, the Lord and no one else can, in the Lord and no one else can be found the true light of wisdom, solid virtue, and overflowing goodness. We can never really seek him in earnest till we've begun to despair of ourselves. But now the other side, he says, it is evident that man never arrives at true self-knowledge before he has looked into the face of God and then come away to look at himself. So, if it is true that knowledge of the self presupposes some knowledge of God, it is also true that knowledge of God presupposes some knowledge of the self, and in fact is necessary to yield some knowledge of the self. Now, why is that true? Well, I think there's a very interesting thesis that's underlying this. But what is it? In what sense do I not know myself until I thought about God? Why does he think? This really goes back to the argument of Hilary and Poitier. It goes back to a number of arguments we've looked at that really say, look, you can't understand the world, you can't even understand yourself without reference to God. There's something about ourselves that points toward God. There's something about, you might say, how do I put it? There's something we can only see about ourselves by contemplating God. What is it? Yeah.
Is this some sort of like recognition of the mind-body problem that God is kind of epistemically grounds?
The mind-body problem and God epistemically grounds everything. Yeah. Let's take a look at what he's... Yeah.
Just to kind of elaborate on that,
Yeah.
it could be like Augustine's illuminations, where in order to understand the truth, you can understand the truth.
Okay, nice. Yeah, actually, Augustine, and in many ways what Calvin is doing is going back to Augustine. He thinks that the tradition has strayed much too far, and he keeps leading back. He says, well, Augustine had it right, we should just stop there. All of the things that have happened since Augustine have basically been confusions. Go back to the source. Really, officially, the source is Scripture, so it's really go back to Scripture alone. But who can tell you what Scripture means? Augustine. Okay, he basically gets it right. And so that is indeed part of his answer. He says, and this I think is a nice point the way he puts this. He says, such is our innate pride that we always seem to ourselves just and upright, wise and holy, until we're convinced by clear proof of our injustice and deviousness, stupidity and impurity. So part of it is a question of just, wait, we've got to think about perfection to really recognize how far away we are from it. Easy to think, okay, I'm a pretty good human being and so on. I know what's going on, I'm good, blah, 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 until we think about perfection and realize, oh yeah, I'm actually pretty far away from that. So it's partly that point, but he says here, I think is the crucial philosophical point. We're never convinced of this if we simply look to ourselves and not to the Lord as well, since he is the only yardstick from which this conviction can come. Okay? Now, God is the only yardstick. We can distinguish several philosophical views. There's a traditional view that you find in the Sophists especially, that you find in, for example, Protagoras in the ancient world, who said, man is the measure of all things. And indeed, that's still a highly influential view. Okay? Man is the measure. We are the yardstick, in other words. It is all about us. And humanity, actually, I think Protagoras meant not just mankind, but actually each individual person. And so at least the way Plato interprets this, Protagoras thinks, look, I am the measure of things for me, you're the measure of things for you, and so on. Here's an illustration. Is it warm in this room? Is it sort of too warm? Well, maybe I find it too warm. Maybe you don't, right? And so it might be, well, too warm for me, too cool for one person, just right for that person. And there's nothing more to be said, right? Each person is the measure of that. Now, everybody agrees, well, some things are like that. Protagoras is in fact saying everything's like that. And so is this shirt green? Well, for me, yes. Maybe you say no. It's just, it might be green for me, not green for you. That's fine. You're the measure of everything. Other people have said, well, let's don't take it that way. Make it an individual relativism. Let's say it's relative to mankind. Mankind is the measure of all things. We are the measure of all things taken together. That would be another interpretation that keeps mankind in the center. Now, another thought, which I think is sort of Plato's thoughts in a way, although maybe not. Well, that's not really fair. But it's certainly fair to Aristotle. For Aristotle, the world is the measure of all things. So the idea really is that, look, no, this is an external standard against which I must compare myself. And for Aristotle, that really is the world. Truth is a question of saying that they are and having things actually be that way. Falsehood is saying of things that are not that they are, or of things that are that they are not. And so the world is the standard, the world is the measure. I judge everything by correspondence to the world. And indeed, that's the way Aquinas treats things. That's his explicit criterion of truth, correspondence with the world. But now Calvin is saying something, I think that's meant to be in opposition to both of those things. Not that man is the measure, not that the world is the measure. What for Calvin is the measure? God, exactly. God is the measure. So in that respect, yeah, of course I can't know myself about God, and knowing God is something that brings me a certain kind of self-knowledge because I realize God is the yardstick. God is the measure. And so really up to then, I have this tendency of pride to inflate my own sense of goodness and knowledge and all of that. But why do I do it? Because until I recognize what the true yardstick is, it's very easy for me to. If I'm the yardstick, I'm getting it right? I say it's too warm, well, I'm right about that. Because it's too warm for me. And so, in short, I can't really be wrong. If the standard is the world, well, there are lots of things I think I know about the world, like that there's a table in the room, and that I'm talking, and that this book was written by John Calvin, and blah, blah, blah. Lots of things I know about the world, and so I can think pretty well of myself. Lots of things I know about the world. But, if God is the measure of all things, then my knowledge is a lot more limited. And so, from his point of view, this is really the crucial thing. You put it in terms of an epistemic standard, and I think that's exactly right. Really, God becomes the standard. God is the measure. God is the yardstick. And that is going to affect our view of ourselves in a very fundamental way. Now, there's another thing that comes out, even in the first page, which is, there's one thing I can't leave out about this. He makes a reference to Plato, kind of something. He says, it is like an eye which has never been shown anything other than black possessing an object, which is really off-white or discolored as pure white. To take this further, if at midday we look at the ground or on any object which is lying around, we think our eyesight is strong and accurate. But when we look up at the sun and gaze at it with no protection. Now, what's the image here in the background? He's thinking of emerging from the cave, right? And being out of basically going to the realm of forms and sort of. He says, the vision which was fine for the earth is so dazzled and confused with the brilliant sunlight that we have to admit the clear sight for earthly things is very dim when applied to heavenly things. It's exactly the same when it comes to assessing our spiritual qualities. So, unlike Plato's image, where you come out at first you're just looking at shadows, and eventually you can look around, and finally you gaze at the sun, Calvin is saying you can look around and you realize, my eyes aren't really suited for this at all. And you can't look at the sun. And he basically says, it's then that I learn how inadequate I am, and that I'm not the true measure of things. So Plato holds something higher than the measure, right? It's not really mankind, it's not the world, it's the realm of forms. Well, once you think of the forms as ideas in the mind of God, then it's God that's the measure of all things. So I think he thinks of this as really the Platonic answer, ultimately. But notice that it's something that has an implication that Plato doesn't draw out. Plato thinks we can actually train ourselves to see in that world of forms, and Calvin doubts it. God is the measure, but our eyesight, we realize, is really inadequate to the task of understanding. Now, that brings me to something that emerged even on the first page, which is the centrality of the fall for Calvin. It is absolutely fundamental that there is a basic divide in human existence. There is mankind as we were created before the fall. And then there's the way we are after the fall. And I think one of the complications of understanding Calvin from a philosophical point of view is understanding that for him, really there are two answers to every philosophical question. what things were like before the fall, what things are like after. And so, roughly speaking, and he puts it this way, really, the fall so corrupted our faculties, so damaged our intellect, so damaged our will, that we are really now, if you want to think of it this way, severely disabled in trying to address not only questions about God, but really questions about everything. And so if you think about what kind of ethical theory you could adopt, if you think about what kind of epistemology is appropriate, think about anything like that, and you realize, wait a minute, are we talking about mankind as we were created and intended, or are we talking about mankind as we become? And there are two different kinds of answers to that. So, what were things like before the fall? Well, yeah, we had this very direct knowledge of things. We must now talk about the creation of man, not only because it's the noblest and most perfect example of his justice, wisdom, and goodness, but as we said at the beginning, also because we cannot clearly and rightly know God unless we know ourselves. This knowledge is twofold. It relates to the condition in which we were originally created, and secondly, to our condition in which we after Adam's fall. It won't be much use to know how we were created if we are unaware of the corruption and degradation of our nature as a result of the fall. So, before we descend to see what he was, into what wretched condition man has fallen, it's vital to see what he was at first. We've got to look at both sides. Now, we were created as a union of body and soul, and conscience, which can distinguish between good and evil, responds to the judgment of God, and is proof positive of an immortal spirit, he says. But now, when Adam fell from grace, he became alienated from God. The image of God wasn't completely wiped out, but it was so damaged that what remains is an ugly deformity. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Well, all right, let's think about ethics, for example. What was ethics like before the fall? Adam and Eve were there in the Garden of Eden. Yeah.
It was perfect. They followed all of God's instructions.
Okay, good. Before the fall, I think his view is ultimately, look, it's God's commands that make things right and wrong. So I'll put a star here. It's not exactly this, but for the moment, I don't want to focus on the oversimplification here. It's something like a divine command theory, where God commands, and Adam and Eve follow. Okay? In other words, well, there are several things that follow from this, I think. One is this idea that God's commands are defining what's right and wrong. The second thing is that we know that. Now, the reason I put this, we have to, maybe do I want to talk about this now? I'll say the following. It's not for Calvin, I think, just God's command. It's that God commands presumably for a reason, but we're not in a position to know what that reason is. And so, did Adam and Eve know what it was? I don't know. But in any case, they did have full knowledge. So we knew, at any rate, God's commands. Notice that in the story of the fall, God commands that you shall not eat fruit of the tree of the garden, in the center of the garden. And they know that, right? It's not like Adam and Eve later, when child said, well, we weren't really sure what we meant. It's always difficult to interpret these things, right? There were several different schools of thought on which tree it was, blah, 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 blah. No, there's nothing like that. They knew what was commanded. They knew exactly what it was to follow it. So part of the idea is the intellect was clear. If you want to think of it in Platonic terms, we actually were able to see the forms, our vision of those kinds of things. We could see the standard. God is the yardstick, and they could see the yardstick. They knew exactly what was commanded, what the yardstick was. They understood the measure. The will was free, and in both senses, I think. The thought was the will was actually free in the sort of sense in which Adam and Eve were capable of voluntarily acting, voluntarily sinning as well, but also free in the sense of being free to perform the good. And so I think he really means sort of free to choose, but also then specifically free to choose the good. And so what kind of philosophical view goes along with all of this? Well, yeah, you tell me. Now, God does imprint. They have a fair amount of innate knowledge. They are given consciences. Those consciences are actually quite determined and clear-cut. So this is, for example, good in conscience. But also a knowledge of God, for example. And so the underlying philosophical view is really a kind of rationalism. They did have innate knowledge. Now, yeah, let's move to after the fall. Now, we still have a conscience. There's still some, the law is still written on our hearts. But here's sort of like what's happened. The fall, right? Actually, I don't have to appeal to something elaborate. I can just appeal to age. Okay? I used to have pretty good eyesight. And now, when I take off my glasses, you're all sort of vaguely humanoid blobs. I can tell you're human beings. And because I know and have lots of experience with you in this class, I can tell who's who, actually. But if you were unfamiliar to me, I wouldn't be able to. Now, the people in the first row, I can see you pretty well. People in the back row, I can see actually moderately. But in between, you're all just fuzzy nuts. Okay? Now, our situation due to the fall is something like that. Okay? What's happened sort of normally and gradually through age is something that happens all at once. So, is it that Adam and Eve have lost their vision? Are they blind after the fall? No, they're not blind, but it's as if they really need very powerful glasses. Okay? They can't see very well at all anymore. So, do we now, after the fall, have the ability to know God's commands? Well, some, right? We're not completely ignorant of them. On the other hand, we actually don't know things very precisely. And so, yeah, ethics would have to say what we really end up with now is sort of a kind of intuitionism. Which is to say, yeah, we have this conscience. We have these intuitions of what is right and wrong, but people disagree all the time. And actually, often we think, oh, it's pretty ambiguous whether that's right or wrong, and so on and so forth. So it's very rough. It's very vague. There's a lot of conflict between one person's intuition and another's, but also conflicts even within my own sense. Is that right or wrong? Oh, I feel torn, I'm not sure. All of that is now part of our situation. And so, what was written on the heart is still written there, but we can no longer see it very well. It's been badly corrupted. Yeah?
I think that what's interesting too is the way he says all these arguments for the existence of God are actually really easy. All you have to do is look at the world and you know there is a God. You don't have to be really smart. But something in us has changed enough that we make it complicated. And so it's an interesting, our intuitions are weak, but in some sense, it's not because it's hard to see, it's because we're somehow on the verge of blindness.
Right. Okay, good. Yes, actually, that's a nice point, because if you're a critic of Calvin, this is going to look like a kind of anti-intellectualism. But if you're not a critic, this actually looks like an interesting point, which is, look, underlying those complicated arguments is actually a very simple intuition. Did I just happen by chance? I mean, the whole world, did it really just happen by chance? Isn't there some sense in which something had to be responsible for this? Right? All these wonderful aspects of the world, weren't they designed by someone? It's like, in a certain sense, there's not a complicated argument here that he's tempted to spell out in terms of premises and conclusions. In fact, I think when you do that, you get confused. That there's a sort of raw intuition. This you might say there's this feeling we have on the world that, yeah, it's not self-contained. And so he says, look, there's no culture that's actually been so depraved that it doesn't have any conception of religion or God at all. So there's something that is left as a kind of vague impulse impulse. And that impulse is right. Trust your feelings, he's basically saying. He's like Obi-Wan. Trust the Force, trust your feelings. Basically saying your feelings are a better guide to the nature of God than your intellect. Your intellect has been damaged. It's going to turn these things into complicated things, and you're going to write premises in the blackboard. You're going to say, well, wait, why couldn't this chain go back to infinity? I don't know. We have an a priori argument, blah, blah, blah. It all gets complicated. He says, look, yeah, it can get complicated like that. Or you can look at a sunset. You can just say, oh, wow. This points to a glory far beyond me or beyond the world itself. And that feeling, he says, is right. Trust your feeling. Because in that respect, you might say, your feeling is now more trustworthy than the intellect. Some contemporary cognitive scientists think of it in terms of systems. We have different systems for understanding the world, and one system is highly emotional, highly intuitive, based on sort of root feelings. It's very quick, very fast to respond to situations. And the other system is rational, intellectual. But what is the relationship between those two systems? Calvin's in fact saying, well, look, the first system is actually good. It's there that a lot of this core knowledge survives. Insofar as we try to think about things rationally, we're going to just confuse ourselves. So that's why I think he doesn't spend any time on those traditional arguments. In effect, you can read what he's saying and say, look, each one of them at its core is right, but the core thought is very, very simple. Yeah?
Why would the feelings be equally affected by the law?
Why wouldn't they be as equally effective? Well, they certainly are effective, yeah.
One thing I would modify is I think there's probably a difference between a feeling and an intuition in this particular sense. He's not talking about feelings like we think emotions. It's just our gut instinct is somehow
like that conviction.
What?
Or like that conviction. It's like
kind of a conscience that, or a just an instinct. I guess it's
yeah. If we think of it, in fact, the currently popular term for this sort of thing is a seeming. What seems to be the case. So good, if we think in terms of our emotional natures and so on, they're highly corrupted too. But, and all you have to do is watch daytime TV to realize that. But, yes, there is this more refined sense of it, a feeling in the sense of an intuition, a seeming, that is where there's still a core of that knowledge that survives. It's not very highly developed, it's still pretty imprecise, but nevertheless, it's sort of the vestige of what used to be a very clear and bright knowledge. Yeah.
It's kind of like some Eastern thought, like a Sufi thought, like mystical insight. That's the way I would see this, where you have like just a direct grasp without reflection or thinking about truth.
Direct grasp. Yeah, I think from his point of view, that is more sort of characteristic of this before the fall, right? Here we really do have a direct grasp of truth, of goodness, also of God, and so on. Here it's basically an indirect grasp of things. Now you're right to say there is something about these seemings that actually is reminiscent of that thought, but I think his view is they don't actually carry you terribly far, and so when he starts listing the ways in which we actually do have the potential for knowing about God, mystical insight is not among his list. He talks a lot about revelation, scripture, our own conscience in the sense in which we can sort of have basic feelings about these things. But yeah, at the level of sort of a path of enlightenment or something, I don't think there's anything quite like that. Basically we're forced to deal with things too indirectly. But I agree with you that there's another way of taking that sort of thought which will lead in that direction, even if it's not his way of taking it. Okay, so what about epistemology? If we're basically rationalists here, well, I've said, in a sense, he's still a rationalist. He's still a Platonist, but who thinks that the eyes of the mind, basically, with which we view the forms in Plato, are just not very good. The eyes of the mind have been damaged, and so, actually, that's cute. Basically, we really need glasses, right? We've got the eyes of this world, which may or may not need glasses, but the eyes of the mind that see the forms, we have this vague vision. So just as I can, for example, know something about what's going on around me, even without my glasses on, but it's kind of vague. So we can have some knowledge based on this eye of the mind, but it's very vague. So I'll put it this way. He is, from this point of view, a moderate rationalist. We can no longer grasp things directly. And in fact, what we can grasp is much weaker. So this moderate rationalism, as opposed to the more extreme rationalism here, where we have direct knowledge, here we have really a highly indirect apprehension. And it's not only indirect, but it's also, well, vague, highly fallible, etc. Rationalists have tended to think, okay, we have some innate knowledge, but it's the kind of thing we couldn't be wrong about, blah, blah, blah. Thinking, well, no, it's not really like that. Okay? There is still some vision of the forms, but it's actually really unclear, it's vague, we can easily be mistaken about it. Just think of justice. Here, they know exactly what right and wrong are, they have a clear conception of justice. Now, well, the law is still written on our hearts somewhere, we still have a vague sense, but it's vague, it's highly fallible, people disagree about it all the time, it's highly incorrect. We no longer have that sort of interpretation. Yeah.
I like that analogy because if you take how he's explaining other religions, because he goes into great detail, and it's in some sense a start of this trying to explain what happens with other religions. Some people see one person and they see double, right? So the polytheists are seeing double or triple or quadruple or whatever because there really is something there that's sparking their eyes to think, but it's multiplying it. And there are some people who see one thing, but it's kind of amorphous, and some people are colorblind, and some people, some people just ignore it and shut their eyes. But the fact that everybody seems to see a blob, it's just that blob seems to take different shapes, should suggest that there's probably something there. We're just not all able to accurately depict what it is.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's a great point. Since this is highly vague and fallible, so it is as if people are seeing this blob. Everything points in a certain direction, and they look and yeah, it's there. And the Christian sees it as unified, but nevertheless having a Trinitarian nature. The Jew or Muslim sees the unification without this kind of structure. The polytheist sees double or triple or whatever it is. And then you're right, the atheist, in fact, somebody closes their eyes. And when he refers to the passage that inspires Anselm, the fool says there is no God. He basically says, all right, why do we call that person the fool? Because basically they see the blob, everybody sees the blob, but then they close their eyes and say, no, they're not deny it. Okay? It takes an intellectual act to deny it, he thinks. Because, look, the blob's there. You can see the blob too. You may not be able to see what it is. None of us can exactly see what it is. But nevertheless, just close your eyes and say, well, let's act as if it's not there. He sees as a sort of foolish and, talk about anti-intellectualism. I think he thinks of that as an anti-intellectual act. So, but it is a nice way of thinking about what these other religions are like and how they sort of map onto things. Of course, from the point of view of somebody who has another religious view, you could say, well, you're the one that isn't seeing it correctly. After all, you admit it's kind of blob-like, and we don't have a very precise way of characterizing this. So this is one place where he has to rely on, well, other sources of knowledge. Now, what sources of knowledge? Oh, there are a couple of things I haven't mentioned, yes. In this distinction, right here, we are, well, actually, it's probably not just fair to say they are strong-willed. Adam and Eve are actually virtuous. Okay? They're capable of knowing the good and doing it, and desiring to do it. And so they're naturally virtuous. But our situation, okay? Actually, we've got problems with intellect. It's no longer very clear what's right and wrong are. There's still this vague impression. There are still these seemings, but they're quite unclear to us. Also, the will. Do we have freedom of the will? No. And so, well, I'll continue this over here. After the fall, we are not free any longer in either sense. We are weak-willed. We are weak of intellect. So our ability to know the good is highly limited. Our ability to do the good if we know it is highly limited. And we're actually not free in either sense. Okay? We are now, governed by necessity. So we used to have free will, but we've lost it. And we've lost our ability to choose the good. Now, what is Calvin's position about this? It's actually rather complicated. I think basically he's a compatibilist. So what does that mean? He thinks, well, how do I put that? We are determined, but, this is a really cynical way of putting compatibilist insight. We're determined, but think of that as freedom. Okay? That's a highly contentious way of, I don't have much fun for compatibilism, as you can probably tell. But that's the idea. We really don't have freedom to act any longer. On the other hand, what we consider freedom in ordinary life, of course we have that. Okay, we think of ourselves as free, we think of ourselves as being capable of deciding, of evaluating things, and so on. Much of what he says appeals to people on that level. But on the other hand, really, we're acting of necessity. We couldn't do otherwise. Now, on the other hand, although he thinks we can't do otherwise, we're running out of time, but this is the last thought I've run out of time, but I couldn't have done otherwise. However, we had the ability to have the ability to do otherwise. So the idea is really, I've lost my freedom, but I had freedom, and I freely chose to give it up. And so here is our situation. We are slaves to sin, but we are voluntary slaves to sin. We voluntarily sold ourselves into slavery to sin. And so in later philosophers like John Stuart Mill or Rousseau or Locke or a variety of others, you'll think of they think of this example of voluntary slavery and actually use it in political philosophy as an analogy to being subject to a king, but it's really, in a sense, coming from Calvin. That, he says, is the human condition. We're voluntary slaves. That's where we'll start next.